Well, thanks for being here today, folks. This is part 2 of the critical component series. So we did the first half last week. Today will be the second half. Don't worry if you weren't able to attend last week's session, because we will still be providing the resources from last week's session. All right, I think we're good. Kia, do you want to?
Yes.
Started?
Yes. So my name is Zakia Holman, and I am a educational consultant with Collaborative Learning Solutions. I've been consulting for about 3 years now, and prior to doing so, I was a special ed administrator and a behavior specialist, a SPED teacher. So I have a long life in special education, and then I did some work in the field of mental health as well. So I'm happy to be here with you all. And I'm joined by Otzi Sanchez, who will introduce herself.
Thank you. Yes, as Kim mentioned, my name is Otzi Sanchez. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, but I am also an education consultant for Collaborative Learning Solutions. I've been here for just under a year, doing presentations and getting to work with fine folks like you. And before that, I worked in a school in an ED classroom, and I did therapy with those students. And then I also have some history doing behavioral therapy in classrooms as well with the SPED population. So I'm just really glad to be with you all today, especially on this topic. COVID has obviously hit us all or impacted us in a lot of different ways, and especially in education. So I just think that this is a really important role, especially today. We're going to talk a little bit about self-care, which I'm very passionate about, especially for our educators. So thank you all for being here.
Absolutely. All righty. So in terms of our session objectives today, we would like to equip educators with critical skills for maintaining well-being, understand the behavior indicators for common trauma responses, additionally identify and implement trauma-informed techniques for successful student return. And here are our norms. We ask that you mute and unmute your mic, especially if you would like to participate. We gladly appreciate that. If possible, we ask that you turn your cameras on, but we know that sometimes that's not possible because we have other things going on, so no worries there. We ask that you lean in and take risk and ask for clarification as needed. You can ask questions in the chat and just keep an open mind regarding the materials that will be presented to you today. And then maintain awareness regarding your own potential trauma triggers. So at CLS, we are very big on connection before content. So this brings us to the part in our session where we're going to ask you to actually engage in creating a word cloud through using Mentimeter. And so the prompt is, we're going to ask you to simply reflect on your feelings regarding transition back on campus. And so you'll be asked to just choose 3 words that describe your experience. There is the link provided on the screen, and then the voting code is 3550-0328. So if you would just go to menti.com and take that, enter that information in, we greatly appreciate that.
You can also use the QR code. So you just take your phone's camera and put it up against that square and it'll pop right up for you. So you can use that one, or Nico also put the link in the chat.
So in terms of transitions and structures, you know, a lot of times when we talk about how we're feeling or those emotions, and we'll go back to that slide, usually what Otzi and I find is that there are a lot of compounded or chained emotions. So when we ask questions in terms of how are you feeling regarding your transition, sometimes we'll see things like, you know, fearful, happy, distressed. As it relates to transitioning. And so my wondering is, what is the best way to support school staff and students quell their anxieties. And a lot of times, really, it comes down to there being, clear communication of COVID-19 practices, policies around mask wearing or social distancing, testing, vaccinations, and etc. And so when we talk about transitions, that's global, right? If we're saying, do we have those PPE there, that's going to facilitate transition. And then also, not only what can we expect from the district, but to what extent are all stakeholders engaged in that planning process. That also helps to kind of have a smoother transition when we're talking globally. But if we're talking about transitioning within the classroom, we really can look at it from three lenses, if you will. So we look at entering the classroom as a transition. We want students to enter the classroom and take their seats. Then also from that, we can look at switching from one academic task to another. And then we all have like exit protocols, right? And so we know that these types of transitions can really be taught through behavior skills training. So what that means is that we can explicitly explain, give explanations. We can model for our students. We could rehearse that how to transition with students, and then we can provide that feedback. So in order for transitions to go smoother, then what we really want to look at is how do we standardize those in-class transitions, if you will. And of course, we have transitions outside of class as well. But if we use class as a home base, just for a point of discussion, we really want to look at, standardizing that process. So how do we secure students' attention? So for instance, most of us have some way of focusing students' attention on us. We may say something like, focus on me. And then number two, in terms of standardizing that process, we may look at explaining the procedure. So in a moment, I'll have you return to your desk and take your textbooks out, or something to that effect. And then three, we prepare students for the signal to start the transition. So oftentimes we may say something like, when I say smooth, you'll quietly proceed, right? Not when I say go, because sometimes that gives the connotation that we want them to speed, but we want them to smoothly transition to the next activity. And then four, we could initiate that transition and actually say smooth, and we observe and see whether or not students are actually doing what it is that we ask them to do, which is to transition smoothly. But with that process, and that could have been the typical process prior to COVID, right? Pre-pandemic. But now what we really have to do is also build in a sixth step, which is making sure that there is still an opportunity for belonging in community. So giving students feedback, but also asking them, what was that transition like for you? And how are you feeling? What I'm trying to get at is we're going to have to be a lot more explicit during our transitions now, not just procedural and moving students through various processes, but because we are still in a pandemic, we're going to have to make sure that we are checking in explicitly with students throughout those transitions now. And so, as you know, things have changed and they will continue to change, but we just really wanted to bring that point forward, that the way in which we are transitioning back into in-person learning and the expectations we place on students really has to build or be about having some feedback from students in terms of the processes themselves and how they are feeling overall, because we are in a state where a lot of trauma has still taken place. So shall we move forward, Ozzy? Are we good with that poll now?
Actually, I want to say, can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to add a little bit on this because we didn't get to see it before, but these are some of the emotions that were identified, these are pretty common themes from what we've heard working with different people from different schools. Absolutely. There is a lot of excitement around going back to school, which is great, but there is there's apprehension there, feeling overwhelmed, feeling worried, feeling scared. feeling a little anxious about it. So just like Kia was saying, we do have to keep some of these emotions in mind, because if these are the things that we're feeling as adults, these are also the things that kids are feeling, and maybe to a greater degree. So I just wanted to throw that in there in regards to this upcoming transition.
Awesome. All right. And so now we're going to have you all take another poll. And this time we're really going to look at what does your site already have in place? So what do we already have in place to manage this transition? And we will be able to take a look at those results as well. And then the second question is, my site or district has routines, processes in place. And so you can answer agree, somewhat agree, or disagree.
So there's 5 questions in the poll. And if hopefully it applies to you. If it doesn't, that's okay. You can just talk about either whatever location you're at. If you feel like physical safety, like you have everything you need, you have PPE, you have cleansers, you have people cleaning the space, and also, do you feel like there's routines and processes in place? Are there signs everywhere? Are there clear expectations of what the students need, and that they have all of their needs covered? And then looking at some of those emotional support services, especially because I think we do tend to focus a little bit more on the needs of the students, which of course we need to do. But then what about our staff? What about our families? Are we really covering the needs of everybody that's going through this big transition?
All righty. So next, we just wanted to go over this thought to ponder, and I'll read it aloud. Some days are going to be more of a struggle than others. That is okay, and you need to forgive yourself in order to keep going and growing. If you all want to put how this resonates with you in the chat, that's helpful. And then while you do that, I just wanted to say what resonates with me about this quote. It's just, the notion that we really have to give ourselves grace and perhaps have somewhat of a degree of humility to admit that we don't have everything figured out, and that's okay. COVID being novel was just that. It's a new experience for all of us. And so given that, our practices have had to change, and we'll continue to change our practices and troubleshoot to see what's going to work for ourselves, right, as staff members and educators, but for students as well. And so just giving ourselves that opportunity to say, I don't have to have all the answers. I can have experienced certain emotions around transitions, and don't vilify yourself for doing that. It's actually quite natural to have these sort of mixed emotions. If there's preparedness on a district level and at the site level, yes, that's going to help to allay some of our anxieties, but then we still may have some in other areas, and just knowing that all of that is okay. So if anybody else wanted to chime in on that quote, feel free to do so in the chat.
I was going to chime in on this. It makes me think I had a really wise person tell me to not compare my problems or struggles to anybody else's, and that was helpful into getting to that second part, and just to kind of get past yourself a little bit and stop telling yourself, stop being a whiner. You don't have it as bad as somebody else or whatever, but just to focus on what you need to focus on and grow.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Seth. Anybody else care to chime in? Right. So now we want to move into caregiver trauma, and we're really going to talk about a couple types here. So if we move forward here, we're going to look at secondary trauma. And as you see, it's the emotional duress that results when an individual hears about the firsthand trauma experiences of another. And so if you look there, there are various signs that come with that. If we're talking emotional, how that impacts is sometimes you may feel some numbness, overwhelm, hopelessness. Physically, you may have low energy and fatigue. You can look at the behavioral, how it impacts behaviorally would be just changing those routines or becoming self-destructive. In terms of professional, you may feel that you may notice some low performance or feeling low job morale. Even cognitively it impacts. So the list just shows how it impacts across domains. Cognitively, you may experience some confusion, difficulty focusing, and trauma in imagery. And then spiritually, you could question the meaning of life and have that lack of self-satisfaction. Also, interpersonally, in terms of how you relate with others, there could be that social withdrawal or emotional unavailability. And so when I worked in the capacity of a mental health rehabilitation specialist, one of the young women that I worked with, I had an opportunity to actually provide therapeutic behavioral services to her. And she had conveyed to me that she would be hospitalized quite frequently. And being hospitalized for her was the functionality of that really was to escape her home environment, because in her home environment, she was being sexually abused. And so being hospitalized, at least during that period of time, she didn't have to have that traumatic experience. And now how that, just her telling me that, I didn't live that experience, but being the kind of empathic person that I am, when she conveyed that to me, there was a sense of hopelessness that I felt because I wasn't able to directly intervene in that situation. And so it's just really important to understand how, even if we are not the ones who actually experience the trauma, just hearing of someone else being trauma impacted can greatly impact us. And so those signs and symptoms can be real, and maybe to varying degrees, because I didn't necessarily experience all of those things, but I could definitely relate to some of the emotionality around it, as well as the physicality around it. I did feel a little more lethargic, you know? And so it's just really important to understand, yes, secondary trauma is real, and it definitely impacts on so many levels. And then the next one we wanted to look at is vicarious trauma, the emotional residue of exposure from working with people dealing with trauma. And here are some of the signs: the feeling of incompetence and self-doubt, decrease in productivity, pervasive negative attitudes, absenteeism, cynicism, inflexibility, friction with other staff, reluctance towards change, hopelessness, and resistance towards helping others. And for me, this resonated. Sometimes we experience things, but we may not necessarily have the languaging that goes with it. So when I look back on my experience as a teacher who taught students with emotional disturbances, so many of those students had trauma histories that came with them and that they were experiencing in the present moment. And so there were times where I didn't necessarily feel like trying to intervene was outside of my scope of practice. That's not what I felt, but I definitely felt that I was incompetent to a certain degree to give students what they needed. And so I just want to make sure that if anyone has experienced vicarious trauma, that or even secondary trauma, that you really take some time out to experience and to practice self-care, because when we don't, what it definitely does lead to is not only the decrease in productivity, but also complete burnout, which is what ended up being the case after doing that job for about 7 years or so. That ended up being the case. But these sources of trauma are real and highly impactful, so we just wanted to bring your awareness to them.
Thank you, Kia.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. We definitely need to be looking at ourselves first, right? Which brings us back to the 6 critical components. And the first 3 are the ones that we spoke about last week. And so this week we are going to focus in on these last 3, starting with caregiver awareness, which is us. And sometimes when we think about self-care, the first thing that comes to mind is bubble baths and exercise and all of these great active things that we can do, which of course, still incredibly important. But something else equally important really is looking at those boundaries, looking at that community that we have to lean on so that we're not just working in silos. And then offering to some of that support to our parents, to other people that we are working with in order to be able to support the students that we're trying to work with. So we're starting here with caregiver awareness and boundaries. You can see that it spans class-wide, school-wide, and district-wide, because some of the other topics that we've talked about, there's different strategies at each level. But because self-care is so individualized, it really is the same across the board. So one of the first things we need to do is just be aware of what we're feeling, how we're doing. We'll talk a little bit about this one a little bit more, but in the classroom that I was working in, we would self-rate in the morning and then in the afternoon. And it was just an easy 1 to 5 scale. How are you feeling today? 1 being terrible, 5 being fantastic. And then a little bit about why you might be feeling that way. And we never pushed the students with this. So if they said, you know what, I'm feeling at a 1, I really don't want to talk about it, we weren't pushing it, but we were also just kind of keeping in our minds, okay, that's a kiddo I need to check in with later. Also, because we were also as staff also doing the self-rating, it gave us that opportunity to increase the awareness of where we're at as well. Sometimes I was rushing to work, just grabbing a banana or something on the way. I might have, been speeding a little bit here and there. So by the time I got into the classroom, I would really have to kind of self-check and go, wait, how am I today? Am I more of a 3? Am I a 4? And I might even be transparent with the kids and say, you know what? I had kind of a rushed morning. I'm at like a 3 right now. I'm hoping once I get a cup of coffee in me, I'll be closer to a 4. But I could also go in there and say, you know what, guys, I didn't sleep very well today. I'm kind of like between a 2 and a 3. And that also gave the students that awareness of, oh, okay, so if she's acting a little differently today, this is why. It's not something that I did. It's not personal to me. She's not playing favorites necessarily. It's because she's not having that great morning. But we have to have that awareness first before we can implement anything else, right? The next part is going to be the boundaries, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But the boundaries are super important just because that's what kind of helps to keep us, I don't want to say in line because that's not really the right energy around it, but it's what gives us that feeling of safety, security, and dependability, just like it does for our students. So for example, I had an AP that I worked with last year. She was fantastic with the kids. And I would email her back and forth just every now and then. And she emailed me back one day and I looked at the timestamp, it was 11 p.m. So the next day I followed up with her and I said, I just acknowledged it. I said, I noticed that you replied back to me at 11 p.m. Why weren't you asleep at that time? And she said, oh my gosh, she said, that is a constant battle with my husband. He's always telling me to get off the phone. I was emailing you from the bathroom because I didn't want him to know. So, I mean, great example of how we just get so involved and passionate with our work where it's almost a 24/7 job. But at the same time, we're also giving ourselves a no when we're giving somebody else a yes. And sometimes we need to take some of those yeses back for ourselves so that we really can give our best selves, because otherwise we're just giving a compromised version of ourselves, right? So those boundaries are another part of self-care. Sometimes I think a bigger part, just because we have to really be mindful of those on a daily moment to moment basis sometimes. We do need to practice self-care, and sometimes that is active self-care. Sometimes that's more inactive self-care. So it might just be giving ourselves permission and the opportunity to not do anything, or to just, you know what, I'm going to go walk on my lunch break. I'm going to go eat my lunch in my car just so I'm not in the classroom. It really is just a matter of finding little ways to tweak our schedules in our day so that we are giving ourselves the time to just breathe and be calm and safe within ourselves. Now, if we do have that extra time, then we do want to be able to create some goals for ourselves, have some kind of an action plan, just like we would for our students. If, you know, Susie over here is struggling with math or something, we might give her a little extra support around that. Same with ourselves. If we are not getting enough sleep, if we're not eating meals when we're supposed to be, those are some things that we might need to make goals for ourselves around. So there's different ways of doing that. Practicing mindfulness is a great way because that's something we can do throughout the day. We can do that with our students. We can do it when we're alone. We can do it in the bathroom. We can do it anywhere. So just a great intervention that we can grab from. And then accessing those supports. We don't, usually we have other, you know, other educators or other friends, people in our personal lives, professional lives that we can lean on, but we don't necessarily do that very often, in part because, you know, some people just don't like to ask for that help, in part because I feel like I'm so busy, I don't want to have to burden somebody else with that. But sometimes it's great to create that accountability. I like to think of it as like a gym buddy, because if I am just trying to motivate myself by myself, it likely won't happen. I will stay in bed 15 minutes longer. But if I have somebody else who's checking in and saying, hey, did you get your workout in today? I'm a lot more likely to actually get it done. So we can use our buddies that way. And a lot of people, especially on school campuses, tend to, you know, we have each other, but then we don't want to lean on each other. So we really want to create some of those supports in that community. And then acknowledging our strengths. If I have a strength in one area, but I'm lacking a little bit in another, I'm going to lean on my friends here at CLS and say, hey, Kia, can you help me with this? I'm not as strong as it. I don't know the behavioral stuff as well. Can I lean on you? Can I grab your expertise? So that I'm not trying to just like Google things and do all this extra work when I don't have to, when I have access to this support. And then of course, advocate for ourselves and for staff, depending on what your role might be. So looking at personal boundaries, here's just a quick quote. Setting boundaries is a way of caring for myself. It doesn't make me mean, selfish, or uncaring just because I don't do things your way. I care about me too. So I think we just sometimes need that reminder. We don't always get it enough. Sometimes things like this, I like to put on the wall to remind me, just because it's very easy for me to get wrapped up in other things. But self-care is not selfish, which you may have seen that one before as well. And that's just something we need to continue to remind ourselves of. So here's just a quick range of personal boundaries from rigid to porous. Something I do want to highlight here is that this is going to look very different depending on culture. For example, I'm mixed. I have Hispanic, I'm Mexican, but I'm also Japanese. The Mexican side of my family is very physically affectionate. They hug each other, they kiss each other. They're always kind of in each other's faces talking. There's very little very little that's saved or kept private. Alternatively, on the other side, my Japanese side, everybody's still very affectionate, but not very physically affectionate. They tend to be a little more quiet, a little more reserved, and that might sound a little stereotypical, but that's truly what my two sides of my family, that's what they're like. So I grew up more with my Japanese side, so I would say I tend to be somewhere in between, maybe a little bit closer to the rigid side. And then when I go to Mexico, it's a little bit of a culture shock because it's very, very opposite. So depending on what that looks like, your range is going to look very different. Also, if there is a trauma history, this range is also going to look very different. for children that have been, for example, sexually abused, their boundaries tend to be a little bit more porous. That is something that we have to keep an eye on, because sometimes they are, we need to show them that boundaries need to be a little bit more on the rigid side. Sometimes they overshare personal information. Sometimes they might dress a little more provocatively. So sometimes their physical space tends to be a little bit closer than what we're used to. So just something to just keep an eye on, something to be aware of, and then be aware of for ourselves too. So there's different kinds of boundaries. There's physical boundaries, there's emotional boundaries, there's financial boundaries. You know, the list can go on and on. But just something that we want to be aware of to make sure that we're keeping ourselves somewhere there in the middle, somewhere that feels healthy, where our needs are being met, but we're also able to meet the needs that we need to of the people that depend on us. So here's just some example boundaries for educators. This is not like the must-do list, but it is just some suggestions of things that could help as far as boundaries. We don't always get those designated work hours. Teaching, for example, is not a 9 to 5 job. We're very, very aware of that. Sometimes it's a 9 to 3 and then a break, and then, 6 to 9 or something like that. But what we want to do is just make sure that we are creating some just kind of mental boundaries for ourselves. So it might just be, I'm not going to work past 8 o'clock, or I'm not going to work past this time on a daily basis. Or maybe there's one day I'm going to work a little bit later, but the other days I'm going to keep for myself so I can spend time with my family. Because you don't want it, we're just going kind of towards that work-life balance. We don't want it to be skewed so that our entire lives is just work, and then we don't really get to live life and enjoy. We need to let go of work. That one is a really big one that can be really challenging, especially when we care so much about our students. For me, I can tell where I'm getting to that line because I'll start dreaming about my students. So that's when I start to know, okay, I need to start doing a little bit more in order to be able to let go. And sometimes that's really challenging, especially when they have trauma, when you know that they might be struggling at home. It's hard not to let your mind go there. And it's natural, we are going to think about our students, of course. But what we want to do is just create little processes for ourselves that will allow us a little bit more separation. Before COVID, it was that sometimes that drive to and from work, right? We're driving home from being at school all day. And so that drive is kind of the processing time to start letting go. With the pandemic and having to do virtual learning, it's a lot harder because that boundary isn't as solid. So there have to be other little things that we can do in order to change our routine. One thing I used to do is like take off my work badge. That was like my big thing. And I might pray for my students, and that might be part of my letting go process. But you can even if, you're working in one area or one room, I'm just going to close that door and just kind of firmly tell myself, okay, my workday is done, in order to be able to transition over. But even mentally, we just need that space to be able to go from one situation to the next. Committing to plan breaks, taking additional mental breaks or mindful breaks when we need them. I think every school that I've been at, I've had that situation where I've seen teachers and they're working through their lunches or skipping breaks, skipping meals. I don't think I've ever been on a campus where that hasn't happened, or I haven't seen that happening. But we really do need to be a little more mindful of ourselves in order to be able to really be the best teachers or the best educators that we can be. And one way of doing that too is just the not yet, giving ourselves that pause in between. Because there's times where we just like, okay, yeah, I got to do that. Okay, but yes, I need to do that too. And then somebody comes in, can you do this too? Okay, yeah, I'll get to that too. So we're saying yes to all these things when really what we can do is just say, okay, just give me a minute to think about that, or let me get back to you. Let me call you back. And really being able to define, can I do that? Two, where is that going to fit in my schedule? There's some things that are, you know, hard and fast, like you have to do it. So, okay, well, let's find somewhere in the schedule. There's other things where we don't necessarily need to do it, and we just do it because either we feel that sense of obligation or because we have a close friend asking or something like that. So we want to be able to, when really we should be saying no. So these are just some little things to think about along the way when we're thinking about these boundaries, but definitely a big area that we need to focus in on. So here's some resources in order to help us a little more with that. I'm going to ask Nico to put the list link in the chat. So I'll just go through a couple of them just because I kind of want you to see some areas, you know, ways that you can focus in. But you'll see on the list that it's broken down into the different critical components. So the one that's the caregiver boundaries and self-care, that's the one that I'm looking at right now. So this one is, let's see if I can pull this one up. This one is an ebook, and it's literally titled Self-Care for Educators. So there's a lot of great information in this one. It has other links too to other things, but I mean, it starts with some of the basics: sleep, exercise, eating, that sort of thing, but then also goes into mindset, reflection, some mindfulness things. And then towards the end here, they've got blogs that you can listen to, videos, podcasts, webinars. So there's a lot of really great stuff in here. And then because it's an ebook, you can, you know, print it out or, you know, write on it, add your notes to it, anything that you think might be helpful there. There are some gratitude journals that actually one of our other consultants created. And this one's a 30-day. But this one is specifically for staff. So sometimes just highlighting some of those gratitudes for ourselves keeps us in a more positive mind frame. And, you know, obviously, even as educators, of course, we could create this ourselves, but do we have the time? Absolutely not. So sometimes it helps just to have something that can just give us that prompt, something quick. Maybe you don't even have time to journal, but maybe it's just something that you'll ponder on or meditate on as you drive to and from work, or as you're switching, you know, from one thing to the next in all of your routine or your all of your tasks for the day. There is the wheel of mindfulness. This one is actually just a wheel of names. I love this thing. A lot of the elementary, well, and actually even the secondary, but this is a great one because you can just click on it. The whole thing spins, it cheers as soon as it lands on one. So you can use this with student names, but I used it with some mindfulness activities. So then whichever one it lands on, that's the exercise that you can do either yourself or with your students. And then there's also a script that goes along with this wheel that's also included on that list that has like the script for each one of these exercises. So you're not having to look it up and figure out what it is. The other one is the greater good in education. This one is awesome. It has a lot of different areas that you can explore in student well-being, positive relationships. It also has this area here though, the my well-being. So this is where we're focusing on ourselves. This is the self-care space. And if you click here on the stress management for educators, it has all these different exercises and meditations that you can do. And then when you create your own account, which is free, you can like check or bookmark the different ones that you really like. So it's really easy to go back to those. So this is another really helpful resource. Oops, I'm breezing through. I'm not going to show those last two, but there's a couple different apps as well that help you to check in. I mentioned at the beginning that we did that 1 to 5 scale check-in with the students. And some, you know, that's one way you can do it. That's really easy. And then you can do it with everybody. But if you need a little more for yourself, even just to remind yourself to do some self-care, there's some great apps out there that will help you to keep you on track. So, so go, please, when you get a chance, look through the list. There's a lot of great stuff on there, and it'll definitely be helpful in our journey trying to maintain our self-care. So as we move forward, we talked obviously a lot about self-care. Now we're going to move on Well, this is kind of part of it in the sense that if we're not doing our self-care, this is kind of where we end up. Kia talked about secondary trauma, about vicarious trauma. This is another piece of that, which is the compassion fatigue. And this is kind of like burnout, right? So what happens is that we're working with these students. Maybe we have, especially with COVID, we don't know exactly what students have experienced. There might be some financial losses, homelessness. People may have passed. There's all kinds of losses that our students could potentially be coming back with, in addition to the losses and experiences that we've had ourselves. So when we've been working with students and time goes by, especially students with trauma, this is kind of where we start to end up. We start to end up feeling more self-doubt. We don't want to go to work anymore. We're feeling disconnected. The passion, that fire for our jobs just starts to wane. So we start to feel more helpless. We don't want to, it's just a lot harder to get ourselves going, right? This is when some of the compassion fatigue has set in, which is what makes more of that self-care and those boundaries really important, because the more that we're practicing those, the less likely it is that we'll fall in here. Or if we do, it'll be a lot easier to pull ourselves out. So just definitely something to keep in the back of our minds as we're considering our self-care, because this is definitely not where we want to be, right? So another way of maintaining our self-care, but also expanding some of that with our communities, we want to focus in on that community of support, not only for ourselves, but for our students, for everybody around us. And here's just some different ways of doing that. We've got some teacher-led community building in the classroom. You may have already had some training around restorative practices. If not, that would be a great one to attend, because that's a great way of building that community within the classroom. It's a lot of focus on circles, having a lot of those conversations, allowing students to be able to process some of their feelings, to identify some of the things that they're experiencing. And then especially because of that circle shape, there is a lot more of that connectivity that's built between our students and also between the staff. And then of course the accountability partners, which I talked to a little bit, having of course other staff that we're being accountable to, but then also sometimes to our students. Sometimes it helps to be able to say, okay, kids, I'm going to be working on using more positively framed language or something like that. I don't want to yell at you guys anymore. I want to be able to highlight some more of your strengths. So if you hear me start to do that, please call me out. And then you're getting the students involved and more accountable as well. So they're more tuned into you. You're also more tuned into them. So that's just one small strategy of building that community within the classroom. But we also want to do that school-wide, right? We want to be able to share some of our information, share what's working. Whenever I've had teachers or educators in the room together, when we have them in breakouts, they're always sharing these different ideas and strategies and things that they've used. And there's always so much that comes out of that. But because there isn't always that time, that designated time for teachers to meet and say, hey, what's working for you in this area? Or, hey, I'm really struggling with this. Have you tried anything else? You don't always get as much of that collaboration, but even just, curriculum sharing, or just, checking in with, one buddy versus, the entire campus. But these are all great ways of just finding ways to really connect with each other so that there is more of that support and we're not just leaning on ourselves by ourselves. Of course, district-wide, there's other things we can do as well, as far as promoting more collaboration within the staff, or building more of that community in other ways, even just small ways of, okay, 15-minute Zoom meeting, we're all going to have coffee together, something like that. Just keeping things simple, but manageable. Having a resource directory is also great, which can be really challenging because things close, especially with COVID. I'm sure there's been a lot of changes in a lot of businesses. But keeping that as active as possible is great, because then when we have a family that's reaching out to a teacher and saying, hey, we don't have food, or my husband's struggling to find a job, or whatever, then we have all these other resources that we can really send off to our families. So that's another great way of creating that community. So there is but I believe this one's an article actually, on ways to improve some of that collaboration. This one is also on that list that Nico had put in the chat for us. So this one would be just under the community support area. And there's a couple other articles in there as well, just different ways of really making, really kind of bringing the community to our campuses. Because really schools can often be the hub of that contact and that connection and that community. So really as a school, we want to be as prepared as possible to be able to offer up some of those resources. The last one here as our critical components is just giving those parents that voice and choice. Of course, there's PTA, but that can also be very different from just a supportive group of parents. So I know a lot of schools already do have, and I'm sure a lot of you on here already have message boards, email blasts, different things that are going out to parents in order to increase some of that communication. But when possible, we also want to create smaller groups of parents and allow for that community of support, because sometimes parents need other parents in order to be able to just validate and say, yeah, I'm really struggling too. Or my child is really struggling too. What's working for you? Or this is what's working for my child. Have you tried this resource? Or did you know there was homework club on campus? Or did you know there's this social skills group? So with parents, that's a lot of how the communication can happen, or a way to get more of that parent engagement, because they're talking to each other, because they're saying, hey, this is what's working for my child. So so we want to be able to promote that as much as possible. We want to get as many of those parent voices, especially now with this whole virtual experience. There has been a little bit more parent involvement for some cases, because parents don't necessarily need to leave their jobs in order to be able to join a meeting or to attend a town hall or something like that. They're able to engage remotely. So they can have, you know, baby on one hip while trying to cook dinner and still listening in on a meeting. So we want to be able to keep and maintain as much of that communication and get as much of that input as possible. So the parents also feel connected to the schools. And so we're also able to connect with them, give them the information that they need, offer our support, even just acknowledge noticings of, hey, you know, I noticed that your child is doing a little bit better at this, or it seems like they're struggling at this. Have you considered that? So we just want to be able to give them voice as much as possible, make them feel as connected as possible to the school, especially through this whole transition, because again, it's been challenging for a lot of people, but students have been really excited about coming back. So we do want to make sure that parents also feel like they have what's needed for their students to come back, and for them to feel safe physically and emotionally. Ooh. Okay. So here's some resources. We've got this website of COVID resources for parents. Again, this is on that same list, so you have access to all of this. Here we go. So just different, it's in Spanish as well for your Spanish speaking parents, but there's a lot of really great resources on here as far as coping with the crisis, addressing concerns, self-care, telehealth, remote learning. And I just want to add a little, you know, an additional note here with autism and the coronavirus. Our SPED students and parents are having some additional struggles that we might not necessarily be considering. So it's just something that we want to be able to acknowledge, and make sure that we're acknowledging as well, and being able to offer the additional support if that's needed. Kia talked earlier about transitions and how we create all these different processes for our transitions. Our students are transitioning from, you know, from the classroom to the lunchroom, from the lunchroom to the playground, from the playground back to class. So there's all these smaller transitions that we prepare them for. We need to do the same thing for our students, for ourselves, for our parents, and also for the community. And then even more so for students that have special needs, they're going to need even more preparation than maybe their typical counterparts would. So just something that we want to be able to support. And there's also an app here, or this one's a website, but these are all different parent communication apps. So they all do some different things. You may have heard of Class Dojo, that's probably, or Google Plus, those are the ones I think I've seen the most of. But they have a lot of different features that are helpful, you know, logging students' attendance, adding behavior notes. So just different ways of really making things easier and more streamlined for educators, but then also to be able to facilitate more of that communication with parents. So that one, I'm not going to go through all of the different ones because there's a lot of different apps, but you can definitely do some exploring there, and that will also be helpful for supporting our parents. Okay, so we're coming up on the end here. Before we wrap up, we just want to put out a quick survey. I believe it's just a few questions. So if you can just click on, and Nico just put that link in the chat, if you could take a moment to fill that out. And as you're doing that, well, this is just another call out to the resource list, which Nico already has out there. Hopefully everybody was able to get that list. Okay. And as you're completing the survey, as our closing, we're just going to do head, heart, and hands, which is either one thing that you're thinking, one thing that you're feeling or planning to do as a result of today's training. So you can please, if you could put that in the chat, or you can unmute and talk about it if you'd like. But just one thing that you're thinking, one thing you're feeling, or one thing that you're planning to do as a result of today's training.
I'd just like to thank you to the both of you for doing this presentation today. And it reminds me, so I would say head, heart, hands. For me, it is heart. It reminds me I'm very thankful. And it also reminds me that work-life balance, right? To just really take care of self. You can't take care of kids until you take care of yourself first.
Absolutely.
Reminder.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you, Jeannie.
Thank you, Jeannie. Yes, yes, yes. Every time I do this training, the one thing that always sticks with me is self-care. Please do some self-care, because we can have all the greatest interventions in the world, and it's not going to be nearly as beneficial as when we are at 100%, or at least closer to 100%.
Absolutely.
Well, and with the best of intentions, we think we're working so hard to do the best for our kids.
Yes.
But yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. All right. Well, on that note, thank you for being here, for hanging out with us. Hopefully that you've gained something. Hopefully you will take a moment with the resources and really dig in there. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. We do have some other training opportunities. Community of Equitable and Inclusive Practices. This one is a 6-hour training, and it's for specific groups. So this one is kind of worded like teachers, parents, and students. Everybody's going to be thrown into one, but they are targeted. So it'll be a group of teachers or a group of parents or a group of students, really looking at those equitable and inclusive practices. So really great training. The other one I kind of gave a nod to earlier, the restorative practices. Because we want to be able to restore some of those relationships that have been broken, right? We want to be able to create the community in the classroom, do some of those circles. And then if something does happen, if somebody is harmed or if there's some kind of incident in the class, the restorative practices really allows us to go in and be able to restore some of those relationships so that it doesn't become a snowball of just additional anger or people not being able to get along with one another. So that one is a little bit more extensive, but both of these are at no cost. So if you are interested, please contact Nico. His information is here on the bottom, and he also put it in the chat. So feel free to reach out for that. And then we have our next webinar coming up next Thursday, which would be the authentic relationships with ourselves and others. So kind of a continuation of the self-care piece, really kind of expanding that into our relationships. Oops. And then following that on the 13th, we have equity, understanding implicit bias. Sorry, Jeannie, did you have
Just
something?
think back when we said those other classes are at no cost, I think that can be scheduled at the discretion of whoever is interested in them, and they're no cost only through June 30th.
Oh, okay. June 30th. So get on it. Thank you. So yes, we have the authentic relationships next, and then also understanding implicit bias. So we have the registration links for those. Nico also has those in the chat. And I think we're good to go. So again, thank you all for being here. And we're hoping to hear from you or see you in our next training.
Thanks so much for attending.
Wonderful.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.